Scotland has one of the most fascinating genetic histories in all of Europe. Because Scottish DNA is not built from one people, it is the result of ancient tribes, Celtic migrations, Viking invasions, forgotten kingdoms, and thousands of years of populations colliding at the very edge of Europe. For centuries, people have tried to answer a difficult question: who are the Scottish actually closest to genetically? The answer is far more complicated than most people realize, because Scottish DNA carries traces of multiple worlds at once. Ancient hunter-gatherers who survived after the Ice Age, Celtic-speaking peoples who spread across Britain and Ireland, the mysterious Picts who once ruled northern Scotland, Anglo-Saxon settlers moving north from England, Norse Vikings who arrived across the North Sea, and later migrations that continued reshaping the Scottish population over centuries. Modern genetic studies have revealed something extraordinary. Scottish DNA still preserves echoes of these ancient kingdoms even today. In some regions of Scotland, the genetic structure is so old and distinct that scientists can still detect patterns connected to the Picts, Gaels, Britons, and Norse populations of the early medieval world. And this raises a much bigger mystery. If Scottish DNA contains all these ancient layers, then who around the world shares the closest genetic connection to the Scottish people today? The answer leads through Ireland, Wales, Northern England, Scandinavia, and deep into the forgotten history of the British Isles itself. Because Scottish DNA is not just Scottish, it is a living map of ancient Europe. And the deeper scientists looked, the stranger Scotland became. To understand why those connections exist at all, you have to go back to the very beginning. The oldest layer of Scottish DNA reaches back thousands of years before Scotland even existed. Long before castles, before clans, before kilts, and before written history, small groups of hunter-gatherers were already living across the land that would eventually become Scotland. These were some of the earliest people to move north into Britain after the Ice Age retreated. At that time, Scotland was still a harsh and changing landscape. Glaciers were disappearing, forests were spreading, animals were returning to lands that had been frozen for thousands of years, and human beings followed them. These early settlers survived by hunting, fishing, and moving across the rugged landscape in small groups. For thousands of years, these hunter-gatherer populations formed the first deep foundation of Scottish DNA. And remarkably, parts of that ancestry may still survive today. Modern genetic studies have found evidence that ancient Mesolithic ancestry remained present in later populations across Britain and Ireland. But Scotland's genetic story did not stop there. Around 4000 BC, new populations began arriving from continental Europe. These were Neolithic farmers. Unlike the hunter-gatherers before them, they lived in permanent settlements, raised animals, and farmed the land. They also brought new ancestry into Britain. Ancient DNA studies later confirmed that these early farming populations were genetically different from the hunter-gatherers already living in the islands. Then later came another enormous shift: the Bell Beaker migrations. Around 2500 BC, Bronze Age populations associated with the Bell Beaker culture spread into Britain carrying large amounts of steppe ancestry. And according to major ancient DNA studies, their arrival may have transformed Britain's genetic landscape on a massive scale. This ancient ancestry became the deepest foundation of Scottish DNA, a mixture of hunter-gatherers, early farmers, and Bronze Age migrants layered together over thousands of years. And this is one reason Scottish DNA often appears closely connected to Irish and Welsh DNA today, because all three populations share deep roots connected to the ancient peoples of the British Isles. The modern borders separating Scotland, Ireland, and Wales are relatively recent compared to the age of the ancestry itself. DNA remembers older histories, and in genetic terms, the peoples of the Celtic regions of the British Isles remain deeply connected. This connection becomes especially visible in Western Scotland and the Highlands, where geography helped preserve older ancestry patterns for centuries. The mountains, the islands, the rough Atlantic coastlines, all slowed outside influence and protected older genetic layers longer than in many other parts of Britain. This is why many researchers believe some of the closest DNA connections to Scottish people are found among the Irish and Welsh populations. Not because they are identical, but because they descend from many of the same ancient ancestral populations that once spread across the western edges of Britain. And this ancient connection would only grow stronger with the rise of the Celtic world. And over time, those ancient Western populations began developing something even more powerful than shared ancestry: A shared identity, shared languages, shared myths, shared traditions, the world that would eventually become known as Celtic. When most people think about Scottish ancestry, they immediately think about the Celts, and for good reason. Celtic culture became one of the most important forces shaping the identity, language, and genetics of Scotland. But even here, the story is far more complicated than people imagine, because the term Celtic does not refer to one single race or tribe. Instead, it describes a network of related cultures and languages that spread across large parts of Europe during the Iron Age. Over time, Celtic-speaking peoples became dominant across Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and parts of Britain, and this created one of the strongest genetic connections in the British Isles. The strongest modern DNA similarities to Scottish people are often found in Ireland, particularly Ulster and northern parts of the island. This is not surprising. For centuries, the sea between Ireland and Western Scotland was constantly crossed by traders, settlers, warriors, and families. People moved back and forth so often that the Irish Sea became less of a border and more of a bridge. In fact, the ancient Gaelic kingdom of Dalriata connected parts of Western Scotland and northeastern Ireland into a shared political and cultural world. The people on both sides spoke closely related Gaelic languages, shared similar traditions, and over generations mixed continuously. This created extremely strong genetic overlap between Scottish and Irish populations. Even today, modern DNA studies consistently show close clustering between Scottish and Irish genetic groups, especially in Western Scotland and Ulster. And the connection runs even deeper than medieval kingdoms. Many of the ancestral populations that formed Irish and Scottish DNA were already closely related long before recorded history. This is one reason ancestry tests often struggle to sharply separate Scottish and Irish DNA categories. Historically, the populations were never fully isolated from one another. This Celtic connection also extends into Wales. Although Wales and Scotland are separated geographically today, both regions preserved strong traces of older Celtic and Brittonic ancestry. Recent studies involving ancient Pictish genomes found strong genetic similarity between Pictish-era individuals and modern populations in Western Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and Northumbria. That discovery surprised many researchers, because it suggested the ancient populations of Britain remained far more interconnected than previously believed. The old kingdoms disappeared, the borders changed, the languages evolved, but the DNA survived. And hidden inside modern Scottish people, scientists could still detect echoes of the ancient Celtic world. And among all those ancient Celtic populations connected through Britain, one group stood apart more than any other. A people so mysterious that even the Romans struggled to understand them: the Picts. Few groups in European history are surrounded by as much mystery as the Picts. The Romans described them as painted warriors living beyond the northern frontier of Britain. To outsiders, they seemed wild, isolated, and almost mythical. They lived north of Hadrian's Wall in territories the Romans never fully conquered. And for centuries, the Picts became one of the greatest mysteries in Scottish history. Very little written evidence from the Picts themselves survived. Most of what historians knew came from outsiders, Roman writers, medieval monks, or rival kingdoms. That lack of records created endless speculation about who the Picts actually were. Some medieval writers even claimed they came from Scythia or other distant lands far outside Britain. Others imagined them as a completely separate people unrelated to the rest of the British Isles. But modern DNA research completely transformed that picture. Ancient DNA studies published in recent years revealed that the Picts were not foreign invaders at all. Instead, they were overwhelmingly local to Britain. Their genetic makeup showed strong continuity with earlier Iron Age populations already living in Scotland and surrounding parts of Britain. This was a major discovery, because it shattered the old idea that the Picts were some mysterious lost race arriving from far away. In reality, they were deeply rooted in the land itself. The people the Romans feared beyond the frontier were not outsiders to Britain. They were descendants of populations that had already lived there for centuries. Even more fascinating, researchers discovered that modern populations in Western Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and Northumbria shared unusually strong genetic affinity with the ancient Pictish genomes. That finding surprised many scientists because it suggested the ancient populations of Britain were far more interconnected than historians once believed. The kingdoms may have been divided politically, but genetically, the populations remained closely connected, and this helps explain why modern Scottish people often show strong DNA similarities with Irish populations, Welsh populations, Northern English populations, especially in regions historically connected to Celtic culture. The deeper researchers looked, the less isolated Scotland appeared. Instead, Scotland emerged as part of a much larger genetic network stretching across the old Celtic regions of Britain and Ireland. The old tribal names changed, the kingdoms disappeared, the languages evolved, but traces of those ancient peoples still survived inside the DNA of modern populations. And Scotland's genetic story was still changing, because while the Picts ruled the north, new invaders were already beginning to arrive from the east. For the first time in centuries, Scotland was no longer shaped only by the ancient Celtic world. A new ancestry layer was beginning to spread northward from Anglo-Saxon England. One of the biggest misunderstandings about Scottish DNA is the idea that Scotland remained completely separate from Anglo-Saxon England. In reality, the border between Scotland and England has never been genetically absolute. For centuries, people moved constantly across it, especially in southeastern Scotland. After the collapse of Roman Britain, new Germanic-speaking groups known as the Angles and Saxons began expanding across much of England. Over time, powerful Anglo-Saxon kingdoms emerged across the south, and eventually, some of that influence pushed northward into parts of southern Scotland as well. One of the most important kingdoms was Northumbria. At its height, Northumbria controlled territory stretching deep into what is now southeastern Scotland. This brought not only political influence, but also migration, settlement, intermarriage, and new ancestry into the region. As Anglo-Saxon settlers mixed with local populations, southern Scotland slowly developed a different genetic profile from the Highlands and Western Islands. Modern genetic studies still detect traces of this difference today. Researchers found that southern and eastern parts of Scotland tend to carry more Anglo-Saxon related ancestry compared to the Highlands, where older Celtic-associated ancestry remained stronger. This created regional differences that still appear inside Scottish DNA patterns even now. People from lowland Scotland often show stronger genetic overlap with Northern English populations. Meanwhile, Highland Scots tend to preserve stronger connections to older Gaelic and Celtic ancestry layers. And this is one reason Northern English populations are genetically among the closest relatives to many Scottish people today, especially populations from Northumbria, northeastern England, and border regions shaped by centuries of shared history. Ancient DNA studies involving Pictish genomes specifically identified Northumbrian populations as sharing significant genetic affinity with ancient Scottish groups. Again, modern borders become less meaningful genetically, because for most of history, populations near the border mixed continuously. Wars happened, kingdoms rose and collapsed, borders shifted repeatedly, but ordinary people kept moving, marrying, trading, and building families across both sides of Britain. And the DNA still preserves that history. The deeper scientists looked, the clearer it became that Scotland was never genetically isolated from England, especially not in the south. But another ancestry layer was already beginning to arrive from across the North Sea, one that would permanently reshape northern Scotland forever: the Vikings. And soon, the next major ancestry layer shaping Scottish DNA would arrive from Scandinavia itself, the Norse Vikings. When people imagine Scotland's genetic history, they often picture clans and castles, but for centuries, another force dominated much of northern Scotland: the Norse Vikings. Beginning in the late 8th century, Scandinavian raiders and settlers began arriving across Scotland's northern and western coasts. At first, many came as raiders. Monasteries were attacked, coastal settlements were looted, and Viking ships became feared across the British Isles. But over time, the relationship changed. Many Norse settlers did not leave. They stayed. They built permanent communities across Orkney, Shetland, the Hebrides, Caithness, and large parts of Scotland's western coastline. For generations, these islands became deeply connected to the Norse world. In some places, Norwegian influence became so strong that the regions were politically tied to Scandinavian kingdoms for centuries. And eventually, Viking settlers began mixing with the local populations already living there. This created one of the most important ancestry layers inside northern Scottish DNA. Modern genetic studies show that places like Orkney and Shetland still preserve some of the strongest Norse ancestry anywhere in the British Isles. Researchers found that Orkney became one of the most genetically distinct populations in Britain, partly because of strong Norwegian Viking ancestry, mixing with local Pictish populations. That discovery revealed just how deeply the Viking Age reshaped parts of Scotland. In fact, some modern Scots from Northern Island regions may actually show surprisingly close DNA connections to Norwegians even today, especially compared to populations from southern Britain. But the Viking impact was not only genetic, it transformed culture as well. Norse words entered local languages, Norse rulers controlled territories. Norse traditions influenced everyday life across the islands and coastal region. And over time, Norse settlers and Gaelic populations began blending together through generations of intermarriage. This created entirely new identities. Historians often describe these mixed communities as Norse Gael, populations carrying both Scandinavian and Gaelic ancestry at the same time. And traces of that blended identity still survive across Scotland today, especially in island communities where isolation preserved older ancestry patterns for centuries. This is why Scandinavian populations, particularly Norwegians, remain among the important genetic relatives connected to parts of Scotland today, not across all of Scotland equally, but very strongly in northern and island regions shaped by the Viking Age. The deeper scientists looked, the more layered Scottish DNA became, because Scotland was never genetically one people. Different regions experienced different migrations, different invasions, and different ancestry patterns across history. And nowhere was that more obvious than in the divide between the Highlands and the Lowlands, because even inside Scotland itself, ancient ancestry did not spread evenly across the country. Some regions preserved older Celtic patterns, others absorbed stronger Anglo-Saxon or Norse influence, and that divide became especially visible between the Highlands and the Lowlands. One of the most important realities about Scottish DNA is that there is no single Scottish genetic profile. Scotland contains multiple regional genetic patterns, and some of them are surprisingly different from one another. For centuries, geography divided the country into very different worlds. The Highlands were mountainous, isolated, and difficult to control. Travel across the region was slow. Communities remained separated by valleys, mountains, and islands, and outside influence entered much more slowly. The Lowlands, meanwhile, were more connected to England and continental Europe through trade, migration, and politics. Over time, these differences shaped Scottish genetics. Highland populations generally preserved stronger Gaelic and older Celtic ancestry patterns. Lowland populations experienced heavier Anglo-Saxon and continental European influence. This distinction also became visible culturally. The Highlands remained heavily Gaelic for centuries. Clan structures survived longer, and many communities preserved older traditions deep into the modern era. Meanwhile, Lowland Scotland became more linguistically and culturally connected to Northern England. Scots language varieties developed there, trade expanded, and populations mixed more frequently with neighboring English regions. Modern genetic research still detects traces of these historical divisions today. Even within Scotland itself, some regions are genetically closer to Ireland, while others show stronger overlap with Northern England or Scandinavia. This internal diversity makes Scottish DNA incredibly complex, because Scotland was shaped by multiple migrations layered differently across different regions. The Highlands preserved older Celtic-associated ancestry more strongly. Northern Island populations absorbed major Norse Viking ancestry. Southern lowland regions mixed more heavily with Anglo-Saxon populations connected to England, and all of those layers still remain visible inside Scottish DNA today. This changes the answer to the original question completely, because the closest DNA to Scottish people depends heavily on which Scottish population you're talking about. A Highland Scot may show very strong overlap with Irish populations. An Orcadian Scot may show elevated Scandinavian ancestry connected to Norway and the Viking Age. A lowland Scot may cluster closely with Northern English populations shaped by centuries of border mixing. In other words, Scotland is not genetically one story. It is many stories layered together, and that complexity is exactly what makes Scottish DNA so fascinating. But among all those different ancestry layers inside Scotland, one connection appears again and again more strongly than almost any other: Ireland. If there is one population consistently found among the closest genetic relatives to Scottish people, it is the Irish. The relationship between Scotland and Ireland goes back thousands of years. Long before modern nations existed, the peoples of Western Scotland and Northeastern Ireland were deeply interconnected. The narrow sea between them was never a true barrier. Boats crossed constantly. Families migrated back and forth. Trade routes connected coastal communities for generations, and over time, those movements created extremely strong genetic overlap between both populations. One of the most important examples was the Gaelic kingdom of Dalriata, which linked parts of Western Scotland and northeastern Ireland into a shared political and cultural world. People on both sides spoke related Gaelic languages, shared traditions, shared rulers, and often shared ancestry. This helped spread Gaelic culture deeply into Scotland and strengthen the genetic relationship between Irish and Scottish populations even further. Modern DNA studies consistently show Scottish and Irish groups clustering extremely closely together genetically. And the connection becomes especially strong in Western Scotland, the Highlands, the Hebrides, and Ulster in Northern Ireland. These regions preserve particularly deep Gaelic ancestry patterns, but the relationship goes even deeper than medieval kingdoms. Many of the ancestral populations that formed Irish and Scottish DNA were already closely connected long before recorded history. Both populations descend heavily from ancient peoples of the Western British Isles. That means Scottish and Irish people often share ancient Celtic associated ancestry, similar prehistoric British Isles ancestry, overlapping Gaelic heritage, and in some regions, shared Viking era ancestry as well. This is one reason Ancestry DN tests sometimes struggle to sharply separate Scottish and Irish categories, because historically, the populations were never fully isolated from each other to begin with. The deeper scientists looked, the more the old distinction between Scottish and Irish began to blur genetically. Not culturally, not politically, but ancestrally. The kingdoms changed, the borders shifted, the identities evolved, but the shared ancestry remained. And that closeness extends beyond Ireland as well. Because Scotland also shares deep genetic connections with another Celtic population still preserving ancient British ancestry, the Welsh. And in many ways, the Welsh preserve genetic echoes of ancient Britain almost as strongly as the Scots themselves. Wales and Scotland may seem separated geographically today, but genetically, they still share surprisingly deep links. At first glance, this connection may seem unexpected. The two regions sit on opposite sides of Britain. They developed different kingdoms, different political histories, and different identities over time. But DNA tells a much older story, a story reaching back to the ancient Celtic and Brittonic populations that once spread across large parts of Britain before later migrations reshaped the islands. This connection became especially visible in recent studies involving ancient Pictish DNA. Researchers discovered that modern Welsh populations showed unusually strong genetic affinity with ancient Pictish genomes from Scotland. That finding surprised many historians and geneticists because it suggested the old Celtic regions of Britain remained genetically connected far longer than previously believed. The populations living in Wales, Western Scotland, and parts of northern Britain were not isolated worlds. They shared deep ancestral roots connected to the earlier peoples of Britain. Both Wales and Scotland preserved large amounts of ancestry linked to ancient Brittonic and Celtic-speaking populations. And importantly, Wales experienced less Anglo-Saxon replacement than much of England. Because of this, Welsh DNA often retains older British genetic patterns more strongly than regions farther east. In some ways, researchers describe Wales as a kind of genetic window into ancient Britain, and parts of Scotland, especially the Highlands and Western regions, preserve similar ancestry patterns as well. This helps explain why Scottish people, particularly from Western and Northern areas, often show strong genetic closeness to Welsh populations. Not because the populations are identical, but because both groups preserved older ancestry layers that disappeared more heavily elsewhere in Britain. Again, DNA reveals connections older than modern national identities. The borders separating Scotland and Wales are relatively recent compared to the age of the ancestry itself. And the deeper scientists look, the clearer it became that the Celtic regions of Britain still carried echoes of a much older shared world inside their DNA. And only recently did science finally develop the tools powerful enough to uncover just how deep those ancient connections truly were. For most of history, people could only guess where populations came from, but modern genetics changed everything. Scientists can now analyze ancient skeletons, mitochondrial, DNA, Y chromosomes, autosomal DNA, haplotype sharing to reconstruct how populations are related. And Scotland became one of the most fascinating case studies in Europe. Recent genetic studies found that modern Scottish populations still preserve patterns connected to ancient kingdoms and historical migrations. Researchers detected clear signals linked to Picts, Gaels, Britons, Norse Vikings, Anglo-Saxons all surviving inside modern Scottish DNA. One of the most important findings was a strong continuity between ancient Iron Age populations and many modern Scots. This means that despite invasions, wars, and migrations, large parts of Scotland's ancestry remained deeply local for thousands of years. At the same time, the studies also confirmed strong overlap with neighboring populations. Irish, Welsh, Northern English, Scandinavian groups, particularly Norwegians in northern Scotland. The deeper the science advanced, the clearer one thing became. Scottish DNA was never isolated. It was shaped by constant movement, mixing, survival, and adaptation across the entire North Atlantic world.